All right, eighth graders, here we are. We are finishing up our evidence for evolution, ways that we know that things gradually change over time. We're going to look at an example of some bears. Take a look at these different types of bears from around the world. They live in different environments. And these bears have changed over time to adapt to their environment to be best suited to that environment so that they can survive. At the top here, we have a black bear and a brown bear. There's a polar bear. This is a spotted bear. And then here we actually have an interesting example. These are all black bears, but one of them is in lighter color than the others. So black bears and brown bears, we typically find them in what kind of environment? They're found in the woods where it's dark and trees have dark bark, so brown and black colors tend to blend in with their environment so that predators, even people, can't find them and hunt them out. They like to blend in their environment for better chances of survival. Same thing goes for a polar bear. We know that a polar bear is white because its environment is snowy and cold. It has a thicker coat and lots of blubber to keep it warm in its cold environment. These are all adaptations or changes over time that this species of bear has developed. Now, these are all bears. They have a common ancestor, but over long periods of time and generations, each different type of bear or species of bear has adapted or made little changes in its DNA so that it can survive in its environment in which it lives. Again, the polar bear is white so it can blend in or camouflage away from predators. It has a thicker, warmer coat so that it can survive in colder areas. Same thing for this spotted bear over here. Now, this bottom one is an interesting example. These are all black bears. However, the mommy bear is kind of a blonde or light color, almost resembles a polar bear. However, it lives in the woods. That is due to a mutation in its DNA. And we know that when we talk about DNA, all sorts of mutations or changes sometimes randomly happen and cause its phenotype, or the way that it looks, to be a little bit different. Now, typically, that is a mutation that would not be good for this bear because it stands out in its environment. It's more likely to be spotted by predators. A lot of times, mutations like that, where it is not beneficial to the organism, those organisms tend to die out before they reproduce, and therefore those special traits don't usually get passed on. This bear has obviously had its cubs, but its cubs are that more natural black bear color that survives and blends in with its environment. Geographic distribution. So this is evidence based on fossils, again, that we know that things have changed over time. When we talked about in geology, Pangea and continental drift, we know that at one time in Earth's history, millions of years ago, that we had this one supercontinent where all of our continents were one big continent called Pangea. When those continents came together, they also had a similar climate. Some of the different fossils, examples of fossils that we found on all of these different continents that now, like South America and Africa, have typically very warm climates, but Antarctica is a very cold climate, very different now in present day. We can look at different fossils, though, and know that these continents must have been together in a similar climate at one time, especially looking at this Glossopteris, all right? This is a plant fossil. It is found in very warm tropical climates. Let me skip forward real quick so you can see an example of what this plant looks like. So as you can see, this almost looks like a strawberry. These are very warm climate type plants. You would not typically see these growing in the snowy tundra of Antarctica where it's very, very cold. But because we know what this organism, this plant was like, that it grows in a tropical area, and we found fossils on the continent of Antarctica, it leads us to believe and gives us evidence that Antarctica once was a more tropical environment. It must have been closer to the equator at one time. So some of the same fossils have been found on different continents, as an example. Also, it's important to point out that islands usually have their own unique types of plants and animals. Islands are very different than the mainland in a lot of ways, and we'll get to an example of that, like in the Galapagos Islands, in a moment. So just keep in mind that this is another fossil evidence for that things, not just living things, but that the Earth has changed over time. All right, what is speciation? So in your notes, you need to be able to come up with an example or a definition of speciation. So speciation is how new different species develop over time. Take a look at this picture up here. This shows, we know that current dogs, they have a common ancestor of the gray wolf. All right, so this is almost like a family tree, and you can almost think of like your own family tree as an example. So this would be like your great-grandmother way back, and then she had some children, and then those children married people from other families with different DNA, different traits, and they had babies, and that created new separate families down here in your family tree. The same thing happens with organisms, all right? This is our gray wolf, our common ancestor from long ago. And then that organism mated or reproduced with other organisms, and over a long period of time, over generations, we see differences, and these dogs end up becoming domesticated and very different from a wild gray wolf. But they do have the same characteristics of that common ancestor. So an example of speciation, a good example, is Darwin's finches, again, on the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands all have very different environments, different food sources in those environments. Therefore, the different birds, they have a common ancestor of the finch, but then when these birds moved out and moved on to the different islands in the Galapagos with different food sources, they, over generations of time and very slowly, developed different features in their beaks in order to survive. So again, based on the environment that these finches live in and the food source that they have available, they have adapted or changed their type of beak. So some of the islands have cactuses and flowers and stuff, and so these finches had developed these long, slender beaks so that they can reach into the flowers of the cacti and get some nectar, but not be poked by the cactuses. Other finches live on islands where their primary source of food are berries and nuts and things of that nature. So they have these smaller, shorter beaks that they can use to crack open the nuts and eat the food from inside. And then, yet again, even other finches kind of have a middle ground type beak because their main food would be insects. And so they have kind of a middle type shaped beak. Again, all of these stem from the same common ancestor, but they've become different species over time based on the environments that they live in, the types of food and resources that they have. So does evolution still continue today? The answer is yes. Things still change and evolve over time to better adapt to their environment so that they can survive. However, humans also play a part in that these days. We call that selective breeding. We've talked a little bit about selective breeding back in our biotechnology unit. Humans have used technology to influence nature for specific purposes. In your notes, there's a few examples you can jot down. One example would be these Belgian blue cows. Over time, humans had bred these Belgian blue cows to be meatier, to have more muscle and meat so that we can use them for food. There's usually a purpose behind the reason that we do this. Not only these meat cows, but also dairy cows. We have bred them specifically, mated one cow with another so that they are really good at producing a lot of milk for human consumption. Other examples of that would be like dogs, for example. We breed different species of dogs so that they have certain traits. For example, my parents have something that is called a golden doodle. That is a cross between a golden retriever and a poodle. The main reason that people do this is because poodles tend to shed less than golden retrievers, but some people really like the temperament and the looks of a golden retriever. So my mom does not like to have dog hair all over her house, but my dad and my brother like to have the dog in the house because he's a companion, he's a family pet. They really like the temperament of a golden retriever. They're good family dogs. They're good with animals, of course. They are good with people. They're good with children. They're fun and have a very happy kind of sense of personality. But poodles, again, don't shed as much. So we have crossed them and created this golden doodle so that has characteristics that are beneficial or that we like. And it doesn't have to be in animals. When we talked about biotechnology, we talked about tomato plants. You can take the genes of one tomato plant and cross them with the genes of another tomato plant so that you have a tomato plant that produces lots of tomatoes. Even just for aesthetic purposes, like flowers. Some people really enjoy beautiful flowers in their garden. And so they have bred certain characteristics of one flower with another flower to create a new flower that's maybe resistant to pests, or that smells really good and attracts butterflies, or just has a beautiful color. So these are all examples of selective breeding, and examples of ways that evolution does still continue today. Peppered moths in England. This is a historical example of evolution. There used to be these kind of speckled looking moths right here. We call it a peppered moth. As you can see, it blends in. You almost don't even see it against the background of the tree that was very common in England at the time. Then when we get to the Industrial Revolution, we start having all of these factories that are creating all of this soot, this black, smoky dirt kind of stuff. And that soot ends up laying on all of the, it's a pollution essentially. And it deposits on all the trees and on the landscapes around. And so in England at this time, during the Industrial Revolution, everything has this brown or black kind of soot on it. And so what happens is these white colored kind of moths start landing on the trees that now have a darker brown color, and they no longer are camouflaged. What starts happening is that birds, predators, are able to see these moths that now stand out in the background, and they start getting eaten, and so they do not survive. So then, over time, the genes of these moths, in order to survive, a gene in them that created this darker, blacker moth started expressing itself, and so this dark black moth, if it's on a brown tree, blends in again, and those genes survive. However, what happened again was that then we started putting regulations on air pollution. So we started cutting back on the amount of soot that was coming out of these industries. And so there is not as much soot on the trees, so the trees start going back to this white pattern. And then as the moth has evolved over time into this darker pattern, now the dark moths are no longer surviving and getting eaten up by birds. And it kind of goes back a little bit, and these white moths start appearing again. So again, evolution a lot of times is just based on the environment in which the organism needs to survive. It needs to change and adapt to its environment, or it will die. Another example we talked about during biotechnology was antibiotic resistance bacteria. Bacteria are living things. This is an example of a skin infection called MRSA, and we're seeing a lot of bacteria are resistant to antibiotics that we're using to try to kill these bacteria so we don't get sick. But bacteria are living things, and so they evolve and change to try to survive. When we use an antibiotic that kills bacteria, some bacteria survive, and those bacteria are surviving and reproducing and passing on the genes that cause them to be resistant to the antibiotics we're giving them and trying to kill them. And so which ones are surviving? Well, it's these mutant bacteria that survive. And then now we're finding problems as humans. We don't have antibiotics that kill these like super bacteria that we have. It's kind of creating an issue to us as humans, but it's a very natural process of evolution. The strongest organisms with the DNA and the genetics to survive are the ones that pass on. And that's kind of Darwin's idea of natural selection that we'll talk about again. All right, thanks guys.